In the last few years, you realized that intermittent fasting wasn't cutting it, no pun intended. You had drumped a bunch of weight, it sounds like, but your muscle mass and your health weren't optimal. And overall, it seems to me that you've come to the conclusion that nutrition is a little bit overstated when it comes to overall health. When other people are like really, really focused on that, you're saying, maybe we're overstating the case for what we eat a little much. So give it to us straight. How much does what we eat matter or not matter for health and longevity?
So I'd preface all of this again by saying nutrition is one of the hardest and messiest of all those things that we just mentioned. Those 4 pillars you just talked about. This is the hardest one to study. It has the noisiest data, and it has the lowest signal-to-noise ratio. So with all of that said, it's easiest, I think, to start with what is abundantly clear, and that's a relatively short list. There was a glib version of my book when the nutrition section, instead of being 2 very long chapters, was going to be 1 page that said the following: don't eat too much, don't eat too little, don't succumb to foodborne illnesses like E. coli, get the right amount of micronutrients in your food. Like, that's pretty much the only thing that we can take to the bank as guaranteed true.
Okay, so here are the things that I'm surprised aren't on that list. Don't eat processed food.
Sure. So I think the problem with processed food and sugar, which I'm not advocating we eat, and I certainly do my best to avoid them, especially processed food, I avoid as much as possible, and I definitely try to minimize sugar. The reason I'm trying to avoid those is indirectly in service of one of the other rules, which is don't eat too much. Because the problem is when you eat processed food and sugar, they are so void in nutrition that almost any normal person will end up overindulging. So here's where the data, and I didn't always believe what I'm about to say. So I was firmly in the opposite camp of what I'm about to say now, but it's very difficult for me to deny the overwhelming body of literature on the following statement. Energy balance is solely determined by input less output. In other words, all calories are created equal when it comes to energy balance. The implication of this is a person who's eating 1,500 calories a day of Twinkie bars when compared to an equal person eating 2,500 calories a day of healthy food is actually going to be losing more weight.
The Twinkie person.
That's right, because they're eating far fewer calories. Now, 2 points to make. One is, are they healthier? Not necessarily. In fact, they're almost assuredly not. Secondly, will they feel satiated? Almost assuredly not. So this becomes a bit of a thought experiment more than a real-life example. In other words, people who are eating processed food and eating junk food and eating lots of sugar end up overeating dramatically. So you're right to say those things should be on the list, but what I'm kind of arguing in my cheeky way is they're not necessary to put on the list because principle 1 is you need to maintain energy balance.
One other question I really have wanted to ask you about food and nutrition and the question of obesity. I'm sure you saw the 60 Minutes a few weeks back where a Harvard doctor named Fatima Cody Stanford went on and basically said something that has, to my mind, shockingly become a consensus, at least in some quarters, which is that obesity is not about what you eat. Obesity is a genetic disease. It's a brain disease. And she testified, she talked about how she had patients who were eating vegetables and whole grains and not overeating and still weren't losing weight. Is obesity about what we eat, about our energy intake, or is it somehow a kind of genetic or brain disease?
Well, I'm not an obesity researcher, though I know many of them, and this is certainly a topic that I've discussed with a number of people. So I worry that the message that was put forth on that 60 Minutes is a bit misleading. So I don't know that physician personally, and therefore I'd hesitate to try to
I'm not asking you to shadow box with her. I'm asking you to contend with the idea.
Yeah, so I would disagree with that, right? I would say that clearly genetics plays a role in obesity, but there clearly has not been enough genetic drift in the last 50 years to explain how obesity rates have gone from 15% of the population to nearly 40% of the population. In other words, there must be something environmentally that is driving obesity that is not genetic. And I think that the answer to that is multi-pronged, right? The New York Times ran a piece, probably about 4 or 5 months ago, where they had every obesity expert in the country in Europe for a sort of symposium. And the way the Times wrote it is there was zero consensus on what was driving obesity. And of course, I think part of the reason was every person is an inch wide and a mile deep in their area of expertise, and their area of expertise didn't overlap. So one person thinks it's carbohydrates, another person thinks it's hyperpalatability, another person thinks it's food availability, another person thinks it's protein deficiency. And the reality of it is it's probably all of the above. There are probably a little bit of all of these things, right? Food availability, the default food environment, the hyperpalatability of food, food availability, all of these things are conspiring against us. And therefore, I think it's an external thing. Now, do certain foods hijack your brain and make you eat more? Yeah, I think that is pretty clear. I mean, I think we see those data that certain foods will drive you to overeat. But again, I don't see that as a genetic problem.
You've been listening to Honestly with Barry Weiss, a production of The Free Press. Find the full episode on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you believe in fearless journalism that pulls no punches, support us. You can do that by visiting thefp.com and becoming a subscriber today.